from 2 weeks ago when you were introduced to Caribbean identity? All right, yes, creolization, certainly. All right, US imperialism. So far we only have 2 people who remember. And Faye is telling us diasporic double consciousness, absolutely. Okay, yes, and even the very fundamental idea that identity is not only personal, it is also social. All right, well, slavery is certainly an aspect of Caribbean identity insofar as the legacy of slavery still impacts upon our Caribbean societies today. Yes, indeed, the Haitian Revolution was instrumental in the development of a Caribbean identity. Segmentary and syncretic. Okay. Yes, and syncretism is going to form a part of our discussion today when we look at religion in particular. Right, so Amanda is reminding us of the fact of identity and the sense of identity. Right, an imagined political community. Now, who can tell me what this definition, an imagined community, what does that refer to? What does this concept, an imagined community, what does it refer to? Not quite, Amanda. Yes, it is a connection between members of a community. Right, so Benedict Anderson would have been responsible for referring to something, another term. And he says that what this thing is really an imagined community. Yes, national identity. All right. So your nationalism. When we speak about this nation, your nation is an imagined community. And he says it's an imagined community, yes, because people, they believe and they feel that there is a connection, but each person is not going to be able to interact with each other member of the community. Okay, so they through shared symbols, shared practices, etc., right? And the symbols of the nation would be some of those symbols that we share that help us to develop this common identity, even though we actually don't know each other and will never meet every member of the community. All right, so it's an imagined community. All right, and Joseph is sharing with me. Why are you looking at? Right, well, Joseph, I don't think you need any help. You're on the ball. I mean, today, I want you to remember this question that your roommate asked. And for those of you who are not following the chat, what Joseph said is his roommate has asked, well, why are you still coming to lectures if you don't have an exam? And that's a really good question as we delve into today's topic, because in today's topic, we're going to look at education. We're going to not only look at education, please remember to turn off your video. As we look at education, we're going to look at religion, because you cannot discuss education in the Caribbean without discussing religion, because it is through religion and the religious institutions that education was introduced to the Caribbean. And here is where we begin. For those of you who are from Trinidad, you may be familiar with these two stories. Now, why am I starting here? Because they both highlight the complex relationship between religion, education, and the social norms that shape our society here in the Caribbean. So for those of you for whom these pictures are familiar, what am I talking about? What are we looking at here? And even for those of you who are not from Trinidad and Tobago, you have seen similar stories in your own newspapers, right? And in both situations, what we are talking about is discrimination. And in these two contexts, it was in an educational setting, all right? And certainly, yes, it is discrimination, not just about people, but people who go against the Eurocentric norms about respectability in our society. And these norms are a legacy of our colonial past. So while colonialism may have ended, the value systems have continued, the mindsets have continued. And insofar as these values have been encoded in the very fabric of the institutions, they will continue to perpetuate themselves. And this is some of the fallout that we see. So in the picture with the girl with the Nubian knots, all right, ministry probes row over St. Stephen's girls here. St. Stephen's is a high school in the southern part of Trinidad. And this young lady, her mother has taken action and asked for the ministry to investigate what she is saying is discrimination and harassment of her daughter because of her hairstyle, which is deemed to be unacceptable by the principal and some members of the school. All right. And on the side, the lady with the hijab, she's a university graduate who was assigned in the OJT, on the job training, a sort of apprenticeship, internship type program once you graduate from university. And she was assigned to a school. However, she was assigned to work in the administration of a Muslim school, sorry, a Hindu school. She was assigned to a Hindu school, but she is Muslim. And she was told that she has to remove her hijab if she is going to come to work at the school. All right. So in both instances, we see where we have this clash coming out of these competing norms and values, and of course occurring within our education system. So in today's session, we are going to take a look at one, the role of religion as a socializing agent in the Caribbean. And we are also going to take a look at how religion and education have formed our Caribbean society. Okay. So when we take a look at religion, we have to begin with the Spanish hegemony. So we would have seen where the Spanish would have been the first in the region. And from their inception, the Christianizing mission has been an important part of that colonizing process. And so you had, from the beginning, many religious orders coming into the Caribbean with the colonizers who were establishing the settlements because they had a mission to Christianize, to civilize these native savages, because there was a belief that they had no souls. They had to save their souls. They had to teach them religion. They had to teach them how to be civilized and how to be respectable and all of these different things. All right. So you see immediately how this Eurocentrism would have manifested itself in the area of religion. because in coming into the region with that kind of mindset, there is a discounting or a total disregard for the spiritual practices of the people who were indigenous to this part of the world. And as the Spanish developed their settlements, church and school were integral to every settlement that was established. And if you look around your own territories today, you will see three things in almost every town: a church, a school, and what? What's the third one? A church, a school, and a what? And you usually have the streets named after them. So you usually have a church street, a church street, a school street. Yes, you have, I mean, in terms of, in relation to the religion, cemetery, yes. Yes, Leah. You usually have a church street, a school street, and a cemetery street, because these were the trio that religion required. All right. However, from the beginning, this Christianizing mission was often neglected as the clergy themselves became caught up with the material gains, and they got caught up with this desire to accumulate wealth, just as the other colonists. So that while, yes, this and we would have spoken about it in an earlier session, God, gold, and glory, the God part was often neglected. All right. However, with the interlopers, you would have had the eventual passing of the Spanish hegemony, and very quickly you would have the British becoming the dominant colonizing power in the region. And with this, you would have had the entry of many other denominations. But of course, the strength of the British in the Caribbean meant that the Anglican churches, right? The Church of England, same thing, basically the same thing. Church of England, Anglican churches, basically the same thing. You would have these churches now rising to somewhat compete with the Roman Catholic Church, which would have been the churches established by the Spanish. The interesting thing about the establishment of the Church of England in the Caribbean is that although they were pretty widespread and they aimed to, excuse me, to permeate the society, the Church of England actually did not serve the interests of the enslaved people or the workers, but the Church of England actually served the planter class. And so while you would have had, for instance, from the beginning, this Christianizing mission to civilize and to save souls of these unfortunate savages, right, who were the native people of the region, with the introduction of the Anglican churches, they never really paid much attention to saving the souls of the enslaved, or following that, the workers. All right. This actually fell primarily to the Protestant missionaries that came into the Caribbean. And as we would see later, you had, for instance, the Presbyterians, the Baptists, and they were the ones who paid attention to ministering to the workers, the formerly enslaved, that class of people. Now, this is not to say that enslaved people or formerly enslaved people did not go to church. They did. But the church continued to have the same hierarchy as the rest of the society. Okay? So that the enslaved, the working class, they sat at the back, and at the front, of course, were the planters the administrators, members of the colonial public service, the hierarchy, and so on. So that the churches tended to reflect the same kind of hierarchy in the wider society. But when it came to the missionaries came with a focus on those who were neglected by these more established churches. All right. And they often were able to amass quite a following because their missions targeted also the children, so that you had schools established, and once emancipation took place, what you now had was this whole new class of people, right? No longer tied to their plantations and therefore no longer tied to particular owners. Free now to make choices. And this provided a new congregation for many of these missionaries that were coming into the region, right? This was important because it added choice. And when you talk about religion, the strength of religion is in the congregation, because the church is not a building, right? The church is the people that constitute the church. So you would see, for instance, the Presbyterian Church played a significant role in the Caribbean insofar as their missionary work focused on the oppressed, focused on the working class, all right? And you had the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, and you had the Presbyterian Church in Canada. And the distinction to be made here is when we speak about the missionary work with the working class, and in particular the East Indians in those in Trinidad, for instance, you have to make the distinction, because when we speak about the work with those of the working class, the oppressed, the downtrodden, it's the Presbyterian Church of Canada that we're talking about, which had a very focused ministry on meeting the needs of these Hindu and Muslim East Indians who were largely marginalized, in the societies where they ended up. So what we see here is a diversity in terms of religion. So we're seeing a move away from the more established churches, which would be Roman Catholicism and Church of England. And you see now a diversity of different denominations, right? So far, all of them Christian, right? And as we move on, we will see that not only were the Canadians, not only were the European colonists establishing churches here in the Caribbean, in the colonies, but you also saw that as emancipation took place, Africans who had retained their own spiritual practices throughout slavery, they too sought to set up their own churches. And in the drive to attain respectability and acceptance as free people in this new society, what you often ended up with is what we refer to as syncretic faith communities or syncretic religions. And what do we mean by syncretism? What you have is a blending of aspects of traditional African worship with aspects of the more established Christian churches. So you end up with the African Methodist Church. You end up with something like the Shouters of Trinidad, the Shakers of St. Vincent. And when you look at their practices, what you would see, for instance, you may see, for instance, Christian saints, right? And these Christian saints may, for instance, have a counterpart in traditional African cosmology. And this was an attempt to maintain and gain acceptance for their spiritual practices. what is interesting here is that they were all Christian churches, but you had Christianity being interpreted within a cultural context that was familiar to them. And that cultural context would have been their traditional African society, the practices and the cultures that they were able to retain. Now, this did not, right, before I make this comment, there's a question here. So the Africans never tried making churches of their own, or was that knowledge lost? Okay, so Gary, yes. The thing is, when you look at African spirituality, the concept of religion as we practice it and as we see it in the syncretic religions is not always transferable. For instance, the idea of religion as a set of practices that you do in a particular place at a particular time is not always transferable to traditional African society, where spiritual practices are part and parcel of everyday life. So that those traditions were in fact maintained, all right? But then alongside that, you had the establishment of churches. And yes, I'm seeing some being shared here. So yes, voodoo is one of those traditional African practices. Yes, it would have undergone some changes coming into the Caribbean. Santeria, yes. Mayoism, Kumina, Orisha, yes. All of these come out of traditional African spiritual practices. Yes, exactly. Pocomania. And I would suggest to you that an interesting project would be to understand what all of these things are, right? So Pocomania and Mayoism in Jamaica, Santeria, which is practiced in some of the Spanish territories, voodoo. And because many of these African spiritual practices were frowned upon and seen as evil by the traditional Christian churches, they had to survive. They had to survive in many ways in secret. And this brings us back to the experience of the Shouter Baptists in Trinidad, or the Shakers in St. Vincent, whose spiritual practices were outlawed. All right. So in 1912, you would have had the prohibition ordinance passed in St. Vincent. And then a few years later, in 1917, they faced the same thing. And for those of you who like literature, when you read The Wine of Astonishment, that book by, who's the author? I think it's Earl Lovelace, if I'm not mistaken, right? Wine of Astonishment gives an excellent account of the experience. Thank you. It's Earl Lovelace, yes. It gives an excellent account, right, of the experience of the Shouter Baptists and the kind of persecution they faced, because they were chased by police. They were arrested for beating their drums and for practicing. They were said to be making too much noise. It was a nuisance, etc. And so in order for them to continue their practices, they often went up into the hills, right? They often went up into the hills to escape the authorities. So that even though today these ordinances have been, you no longer have these ordinances in effect, you still have many of these churches up in the hills, coming out of that tradition of so long having to hide. You know, you had to hide in order to worship. All right. So this is just one example of the ways in which non-European and non-traditional religious practices were suppressed. Okay, I'm reading a comment here. If they lived in the hills, it's not that they lived in the hills, but they certainly worshipped and constructed their churches in the hills in order to escape the scrutiny of police. Yes, someone has a problem with how African religion is portrayed. Yes, yes, yes. And when we speak of African religions, I will acknowledge immediately that we are speaking about a multiplicity of practices, because Africa is a continent, it's not a country. And within that continent, you have numerous countries, you have numerous communities, and you have numerous spiritual practices. Some of them, a few of them, came across the Middle Passage and survived, but it is by no means a representative of the vast number of spiritual practices in Africa, or that would have emerged in African societies. And as a matter of fact, Islam came to the Caribbean with the enslaved West Africans, because at the time of the transatlantic slave trade, Islam had already spread to many West African nations. So that when we speak about African religions, I know many of you are thinking in terms of the more traditional practices reflected in voodoo, Santeria, Pocomania, Mayoism, etc. But it may also be correct to refer to Islam as well, because the Muslims, the first set of Muslims that would have come into the Caribbean were the enslaved West Africans, all right? Right, Shango Baptist in Grenada, yes, the Shango Baptist, also another good example of a syncretic religion, very similar to the Shango Baptist in Trinidad, as a matter of fact, all right? You also had, coming into the Caribbean, other churches which did not have the longevity that many that we're going to look at shortly had, all right? So while we still have a significant presence, let's say, of even those syncretic African religions we spoke of, we still have a significant presence of Roman Catholics, Presbyterians, and of course the Church of England. You also had the Dutch Reformed and the Lutheran churches coming into the Caribbean, all right? You had the Quakers, and the Quakers were an interesting one because they initially supported enslavement, but later you would notice a change in the church's doctrine in relation to that, right? And they later renounced the practice, right? You had the Moravians and the Methodists. They did come into the Caribbean, but had very little impact. And the Moravians were another interesting one because they argued that slavery was natural, okay? That slavery was a fulfillment of scripture, that Africans were enslaved because it was punishment for their original sin. So of course you could see why then the Moravians did not quite survive in the Caribbean. But then we come to a very interesting movement, and this would be the Baptist Society. And the Baptists, how many of you have heard of American Baptists? I remember when I was in primary school, I heard one of my classmates say that she was an American Baptist. And I couldn't for the life of me figure out what that was, because the only Baptists I knew about were people like my neighbor who would have her head wrapped, and she would, who would wear these dresses with long sleeves and down to the ankles, and the colors were different, and sometimes they wore an apron type thing, and that was my experience of Baptists. But then I heard her say, well, I'm not that, she said, I'm not that kind of Baptist, I'm an American Baptist. Right, and what she was referring to are the Baptists that originated in North America. All right, and yes, I've heard of the London Baptists as well. All right. Now, what made the Baptist Society problematic is because it was established by a man who was formerly a slave. So imagine you have, during the time of enslavement, in other parts of the colonies, you have this man, George Liddell, who was able to rise in his faith to the point where he established a church. All right. And you had George Liddell coming into the Caribbean and spreading the Baptist faith within the Caribbean. And of course, if you have a formerly enslaved man who is leading a church, it is a natural attraction for the formerly enslaved people of the Caribbean, because it represented the spiritual heights or the religious authority to which an enslaved person could rise. And certainly in the more established churches of the Church of England or the Roman Catholic Church, that was inconceivable. So at the same time that you had the enslaved having to sit at the back and come through the back door to the church, you had a church being established and run. You had the ministry being led by a formerly enslaved man. And so certainly his focus was on the free people, the lower class, the oppressed, the working class. And his work with these people drew a lot of attention to the Baptist Church, because he, of course, not only gave religious instruction and education, but he was also very active, in the lives of these people. And so you had the Baptist faith spreading and making significant impact in the Caribbean society. All right. If I go back to the picture here, this is a Baptist church in Trelawney in Jamaica. All right. And as you look around, you would see them throughout the Caribbean. You would see them, of course, prominently in Jamaica. All right, so the question here from Michaela is, was it a form of rebelling? Yes, it is. Yes, it was. It was in some ways a form of rebellion, because it was a challenge to the status quo. And particularly when we speak about the Baptist Church, it was an assertion that an enslaved person or those sidelined as being of lesser value were in fact not, that they were equal in every way, right? So we take a look now at, I just want to draw your attention to the way in which the Baptist Church now not only impacted upon the community that they worked within, but what they ended up doing was having an impact on the other churches. Because as I had mentioned before, when you're talking about the strength of the church, you're talking about people, the amount of people you could serve. And as people gravitated towards the Baptist Church, the other religions started to pay attention and recognize that they needed to focus on the oppressed, that they needed not only to pander to the elites and the planter class, but they needed to pay attention to the oppressed. So while I would have said initially the Church of England was not concerned with the lower classes, with the impact that the Baptists were making, eventually, in response to that, you had the Church of England establishing outreach ministries. All right, and it was called the Society for the Conversion and Religious Instruction and Education of the Negro Slaves in the British West Indian Islands. And that was a way of, for want of a better word, competing with the work that the Baptists were doing with this class of people. All right. And the other highlight that I have here are the Canadian Presbyterian missionaries. Now, while they would not have been responding to the Baptist faith, I highlight them here because they were another religious denomination that focused on the poor, the marginalized, the oppressed. Okay, so the Canadian Presbyterians were very instrumental in establishing what we refer to as mission schools. And the schools were set up right there on the sugar estates during the period of indentureship, so that the children of the indentured laborers could be educated right there, right? All right, I'm going to check the chat box in a moment. All right, so Anna Maria is asking if some Baptists are American and other types originated locally. I think the distinction that you are identifying, Anna Maria, would be, yes, the American Baptists who would have originated with George Liele, all right, who was from Virginia. And as a matter of fact, the Americans, which would have been the former soldiers. All right, let me go back a little bit. How many of you are familiar with the Americans? A group of people referred to as the Americans. Right, one person, right, a couple of people. All right, so they are an interesting group because in the war between the United States and Britain in 1812, enslaved persons were recruited to fight against Britain, right? Quite risky, right? Because you're talking about fighting America fighting against Britain in 1812. And the British recruited enslaved people to fight against America with the promise that at the end of the war, they would be granted their freedom. So of course they had to ensure that they win the war, right? And they survived the war. So they did survive the war. And when the army was disbanded, they were offered land first in Canada. But then later they were offered the chance to relocate to the Caribbean. So some initially went to the Caribbean, some initially were sent to Canada, and then some of them who were sent to Canada were later given the option to come to the Caribbean, and they took up that offer. And the place that they were settled in the Caribbean was in Trinidad. So what you ended up with were free Africans in Trinidad who were formerly enslaved in America. And they were living in Trinidad at the time that Africans in Trinidad were still enslaved. So you had this free community of Africans in the midst of a slave society, because you're talking about 1812, from 1812 onwards. And of course, we know emancipation didn't come to the British colonies until 1834 or 1838, depending on how you look at it. And those people, those free Africans who won their freedom because they fought against America in that war, they were coming in large part from the southern states, and they brought with them the Baptist faith into Trinidad, right? And they maintained that religion. And so many of their descendants are still practitioners of the Baptist faith. And that would be what you're referring to. That would be what you're referring to as the Baptists that would have come from America. And then the ones that you are identifying as originating locally, these would be the shouters, the shouter Baptists, so they're called the Shakers in St. Vincent. And what you have here is a retention of a religious practice or spiritual practice that has survived slavery and has mixed in elements of the traditional churches that were established to create something new. And the something new that is created is that Shouter Baptist or that Shaker and so on religion. All right, so that is the distinction there in terms of the ones that came from America and the ones that you would see originated locally. So I hope it was coming out to you, but if it wasn't, let me make it clear that this Christianizing mission could not take place without education. All right, which is why you had, I would have mentioned it with the Baptists, I would have mentioned it with the Catholics, the Anglicans, I would have mentioned it with the Presbyterians, that schools were set up. So it wasn't just churches, it was schools. Because the two went hand in hand. And the first form of structured education in the Caribbean would have been what was offered by the church. And that instruction was intended to facilitate the learning of scripture and the learning of Christian principles and so on, right? And yes, Jerome, what I'm referring to are the company villages from South. So the same companies that formed the regiment, they were settled according to those companies. So if you were in the 5th company in the regiment, all the members of the 5th company were settled in one area, and they called that area 5th company and so on. Yes. All right. Right. So on the board, I have schooling versus education. Why am I making a distinction? Is there a distinction to be made? I would love at this point to hear your thoughts on schooling versus education. And that question that we had at the beginning from my friend, I can't remember his name, whose roommate wanted to know, well, why you still coming to lectures if you don't have an exam? I think if we can answer this question here, we can help him answer that question. What is the difference between schooling and education? All right, so Khadija is suggesting that education can be attained anywhere. The implication then is that schooling requires that you go to a specific institution. Now we're getting philosophical. One caters to the mind and one caters to the soul or the spirit. All right, schooling is a physical structure. Schooling is part of education, and education is the umbrella term. All right. Let's see. Right, so Randy is saying the same thing as Shanice. Schooling is a subset of education. Schooling is a formal institution, right? Schooling is indoctrination, and education is experience. That's another interesting perspective there. Schooling takes place in the home environment, and education is in some form of institution. And schooling is an institution of society, and it's not necessarily about attaining knowledge. And we have a quote being shared here with us: don't let classes get in the way of your education. Indeed. Education is a lifelong concept, which means that we continuously gain information any and everywhere. Schooling is an aspect of education and can come to an end. Absolutely. All right. Schooling is indeed institutionalized, but education can take place anywhere. And we have many people who are well-schooled. Well-schooled, because one of the things about school is certification. Often certification goes with schooling. But we can have people who are well-schooled and filled with certification, but lack education. And then we can speak about people who are educated so that they have knowledge. And when we speak about education and being educated, we are also speaking about relevant knowledge, knowledge that allows you to function more effectively in your environment. And so we often have many people who are well educated without certification. But yes, schooling can lead to education. Without a doubt, schooling can lead to education. But it all depends on the mindset of the person who is in the institution. Because unfortunately, our institution produces many people who are very well educated, yet we also produce many Caribbean citizens who are well certified, but not very well educated. All right. And I bring that distinction to your attention just so that you could think a little more deeply about what education means, because education has been fundamental in the formation of our societies here in the Caribbean. Outside of the religious schools, when we see that few educational institutions existed, we immediately see that much of education was originally religious indoctrination. And of the few educational institutions that existed independently of the churches, these were grammar schools. And when we speak about grammar schools, we're saying that these are schools that were devoted to academic knowledge. And these were, of course, for the plantocracy. These were for the planters' children. The ones who were really doing well, they sent their children back to Europe to be schooled and educated. But for the poorer class, they had to rely on establishing these elite grammar schools here in the Caribbean. Okay. I'm seeing some comments here. Let me just take a look. Right. Okay. So while indeed education did in fact take hold and became an important part of the development of society, it did not happen with the support of the planters. So certainly during the period of enslavement, the planters were the elites in society and they held the power. And although they worked with the missionaries, because the missionaries were often in a precarious position, because the missionaries had to have a certain cooperation with the planters, the slave owners, in order to get access to the enslaved. So even though you had that level of cooperation there, it was, that relationship was filled with suspicion, because the slave owners were always worried that if the enslaved people were educated and they were made to read and they were able to develop their thinking, then several things would happen. They would be better at planning revolts and uprisings. They would be more knowledgeable about the issues surrounding not only slavery, but more specifically the abolitionist movement. And of course, it would improve their communication among each other, because you had, of course, enslaved people being taken from all different parts of West Africa, oftentimes not speaking the same language, and put together on a plantation. It was done deliberately at times to ensure that they could not communicate effectively to plan uprisings and so on. And so education was not welcomed in the beginning. However, with the inevitability of emancipation, it became, and also with the abolition of the slave trade, there was need to ensure that you had a continuous supply of skilled labor. Initially, you had to maintain the labor that you had, and then with emancipation, it was important to ensure that without the whip and the chains, there would be a means by which these formerly enslaved people could be indoctrinated into a particular mindset that would keep them as workers. And so education began to perform that function. Okay? I have a question here. All right, so Crystal says she has a question. Crystal, you can put your question. When you put it, I will respond to it. All right. So you would have had education really coming into being in a large scale following emancipation. And it was a partnership always between the government and the religious institutions. And we still see that partnership continuing up to today. Because throughout the Caribbean, we still have these church schools. They're called, what do we call them? These church schools. Somebody help me with the name. It slips me right now. Denominational schools. Thank you, Anna Maria. All right, these denominational schools or board schools, yes. They're also referred to in some places as board schools. So you still have, up to today, that kind of cooperation. And initially, schooling was not free. It was not free. So you could only go to school if you could afford it. But of course, by the late 19th century, you would have had a change in education policy. But what we are more concerned here with is the way in which education shaped our societal norms. And if we take a look at what schools were doing from their inception, we would see that not only were schools trying to instill certain skills, because we did have skills training, but it was also performing a socializing function in terms of the gender norms in our society. So you would see in primary schools, reading, writing, and religious knowledge constituted the curriculum. But the girls learned needlework and the boys learned arithmetic and woodwork. Because of course the girls were being groomed for domestic duties and the boys were being groomed for occupations outside the home. All right. In the secondary schools now, they follow the academic instruction, language, history, religious knowledge, and geography. But in that period following emancipation, as these formerly enslaved sought to establish themselves as members of respectable societies, and you had families being reconstituted, which we will get to shortly, oftentimes there was a conflict between the need for the children to work and contribute to the home and school. And oftentimes the economic needs of the home won out over sending the children to school. Right. Now, following independence, there was a distinct difference in educational policy. Because with independence, as our nations established their identities, and as we became nations and moved away from being colonies, education was seen as critical to enable citizens to participate in a democratic process. So it was felt that to be a citizen and to exercise your rights and responsibilities as a citizen, which is different from a subject, it was critical that your population be educated And so with independence, you would have had across the Caribbean a policy which treated education as a public good and a social right. And coming out of such policies, you had free education, free or significantly subsidized education in order to make it available. And so you see in our own societies, changes in curriculum, and the changes in curriculum would be to advance our indigenous scholarship. The idea that Caribbean people can produce, they can innovate, they can invent. And when they do so, that scholarship has to be documented and passed on. You would have seen changes in our curriculum content to reflect our realities. While many of us take Caribbean history for granted, for many of us, our parents would not have learned one sentence of Caribbean history throughout their entire schooling, but they would have learned extensively about British history. All right, because of course they would have been subjects in a colony as opposed to citizens in a country. Following independence, there would have also been the drive to expand access to higher education. And the expansion of higher education is important because it is at higher education that we deal with problem solving. Whether we're talking about problem solving in science, we're talking about problem solving in terms of social policy, in terms of politics and political science, medicine, environmental science. This is where knowledge is created. So expanding higher education is critical in the development of any society. And out of these kinds of policies, you have institutions such as the University of the West Indies being established and the Caribbean Examinations Council, which would administer those important terminal exams. Right? So yes, that is why there was a change from Cambridge to CXC subjects, right? Or CXC examinations, because CXC is the Caribbean Examination Council. They administer the CSEC and they administer the CAPE as well. And yes, because when you did a Cambridge exam, your whole curriculum was based on Britain. So you came out and you were very knowledgeable about Britain, and you knew very little, if anything, about the Caribbean, you see? So up to maybe about 30 years ago, students did the Cambridge exam, they did the Oxford exam, and all of that was good and well, except for the fact that you would have come out of school knowing very little about your own society within which you were supposed to operate, and hopefully which you were supposed to now make better. So freedom and education went hand in hand. And as our societies develop, you would see it reflected oftentimes in changes in education policy, changes in curriculum, etc. All right. But school was not only about these values. Schools also taught us important social values. School functioned as another socializing agent. And I ask the question now, what did you learn at school, for instance, about respectable appearance? And of course, I am coming back to where I started, in the way school reflects a lot of the complexities when it comes to competing values. And this one that I have here is from many years ago. This one was 2004. And this was a little girl who had, she had locks. And she was assigned to a Catholic school. And the Catholic school said, absolutely not. You cannot come to our school with dreadlocks. That she had to cut her hair. Right? So this was 2004. And certainly what the school is trying to enforce is the idea of what it means to be a respectable member of society. All right? And so the school uniform rules is one of the ways in which the school is teaching the students about what is acceptable insofar as appearance. And this is just one small area, because school also teaches us other values in relation to other aspects of our life in terms of work ethic. Okay? We learn skills that make us very good workers, make us very good employees. It is only within recent years that there is now an emphasis on entrepreneurship, which means that there is now a recognition that school can also teach its students how to be business owners. All right. So let's see what you're saying here. Yes, I would love to know who's drawing on my page as well. All right, so schools would have taught you, all right, so Eurocentric values from colonialism, right? So your skirt shouldn't be above your knee. Your uniform should be neat. Your hair should be neat. I wonder what neat means. What does neat mean? Okay, so Nikisha, you also faced a threat of, or you had gotten suspended. It wasn't even a threat because your parents refused to cut your dreadlocks. Interesting. Right. So, right, so an Afro style was not acceptable. Right, so in Jamaica, I know for a while, you had to cover your locks. So once your locks were covered, you were okay. All right, so now, all right, so Tanika is saying that now, if your locks are uncovered, it's okay now. Right, and Everett had to cut his son's hair for cleanliness purposes. Wow, interesting. Students with naturally blondish hair were asked to dye it black in some cases. Right, and all of these, right, so the enforcement of these rules, they teach the students what it means to present yourself in a respectable manner. Right, and neat, yeah, neat means straight. Neat means well-groomed. Right, and Carl is suggesting to us that schools are now becoming more accepting about these changing norms. And I would certainly agree that you have that. You also have the maintenance of some of these colonial Eurocentric values, right? Yes, so boys still can't have long hair in many respects. Right, okay. So we have another example here, and this now is out of school. And this is in one of those very traditional, very conservative institutions within our society. And here, this was from 2011, so a few years ago. And what we have here is that this lawyer, Israel Khan, he challenged the court, which had told him that he could not appear before the judge in a Nehru suit. So what he's wearing there is a Nehru suit. All right, its origin was from India. It was popularized by Nehru. So Mr. Khan went to court one day in a Nehru suit and was told he was not properly attired for court. And he would not be heard until he was properly attired. So he went back to his office and he put on the suit and tie and came back to court and he was heard. However, he did challenge the court and he won his case, all right, which said that the court was wrong to not accept his new suit as appropriate dress for the court, right? And this is just to highlight the ways in which some of the Eurocentric values continue to persist in our societies with the institutions, okay? Right. And you know what I see in the chat is very interesting, because many people are having these experiences where their non-Eurocentric self is unacceptable. I'm seeing so many people talking about their hair and their children's hair being unacceptable. And what is interesting about this is people are talking about their natural selves and so on as being not acceptable or problematic. All right. Okay, so when we move on, I just want to share with you some food for thought. Some things for you to think about as we reflect on this role of education in our society. And how many of you know Marcus Garvey? Have heard of him? Right. Good. So a few of you know him. Right. Great thinker from the Caribbean, well known. And he has said to us, if you liberate the minds of men and ultimately liberate the minds of men, and ultimately you will liberate the bodies of men. And you need to think about that a little bit, and it would be interesting in your own private reflections what you come up with. And when you think about what you are doing here at this university, you can ask yourself, to what extent are you liberating your mind in what you are doing? Because it seems to me sometimes that students willingly enslave their minds as opposed to liberating their minds. We have another Caribbean thinker, all right, C.L.R. James. Who knows C.L.R. James? Right, C.L.R. James is another world-renowned radical scholar. And when I say world-renowned, I do mean world-renowned. So C.L.R. James says to us, if we do not think for ourselves, then we perforce use other people's thoughts. To demonstrate for independence is good, but to think independently is much better. Okay, yes, he's from Trinidad. Right, he's from Trinidad, but he has traveled and made his mark throughout the world. So if we do not think for ourselves, then we perforce use other people's thoughts. To demonstrate for independence is good, but to think independently is much better. All right, and of course he was talking about this in the context of the anti-colonial movement. And so yes, you can get political independence, but what does that mean if you can't think independently? And you can ask yourself, what does it mean to think independently? What does it mean to think with other people's thoughts? All right, and how are you doing in your own efforts to think independently? As a matter of fact, have you ever given it any thought of what it means for you to think with your own thoughts? All right, and we try to stimulate that in this course by challenging you to develop your own intellectual arguments and to develop your own intellectual commentary about the things that you read, specifically in the book report, for instance, and then of course in the final assignment. The idea is for you to develop your own thoughts based on information that you have. Right? And of course you take that same skill into every area of professionalism, whether it be accounting or it be biochemistry. You need to develop independent thought. So we have here Marcus Garvey again. The ends you serve that are selfish will take you no further than yourself. But the ends you serve that are for all in common will take you into eternity. And this is an aspect of education that we often overlook, which is the idea that what we do in educating ourselves is not only meant for us to have a better car and live in a bigger house and have a particular lifestyle where we could travel abroad 3 times a year and so on. But to whom much is given, much is expected. And as you gain more knowledge and expertise, you are expected to contribute more to the development of your society. You are expected to contribute more to the development of your profession. So that education is not intended to serve selfish ends, but education is intended for us to make our community, and whether you define that community as your professional community or the community of your country or your town or the Caribbean, education, especially education of this nature, meaning the University of the West Indies structure, which is subsidized, the intention is that you serve a higher purpose than just your selfish. And when I say selfish, I'm not saying it in a judgmental way, but meaning the self aggrandizement. All right. So these are just some things for thought. And I leave you with 2 more. And Paulo Freire, very important Latin American scholar, who wrote the very influential book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And he says, the oppressors do not favor promoting the community as a whole, but rather selected leaders. And that's an important thought for you to give some consideration to. When oppressors promote individuals, it creates disharmony. It creates competition because now everybody wants to be the leader who is favored. And that is to the detriment of the whole. So what Freire was referring to and what he was getting at is the importance of promoting community. That education shouldn't be about creaming off the top, but education should be about ensuring that everyone advances. All right? You can come up with your own ideas about this, because some of you may think, well, yes, education is about making sure only a few excel. But some of you may develop the mindset, as Freire did, that education really is about promoting the entire community. So education is not a competition, it's not a race. So you can only have one winner. All right? And then finally, we have Dr. Campbell, Dr. John Campbell, who was the first regional coordinator of this course and who is responsible for much of the material that you use in this course. And he said that Caribbean intellectualism demands that the region's intellectuals perform their duties and jobs in the context of the region's past and with a clearly defined goal that holds Caribbean identity and legitimacy as central. Something to think about for those of you who aspire to academia. All right, and so I hope at least one of these quotes, stimulate your thinking a little further in terms of what all these various Caribbean and Latin American scholars have had to say about education. All right, so I'm not going to get into this question here. Perhaps it's one you can deal with in your tutorial, but we will switch gears a little bit. And here we have family. Let me ask you, on a scale of 1 to 10, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being most important, 10 being of no consequence, where do you think family falls in terms of its importance in your life? One, absolute importance. 10, of no consequence. All right. Oh, very interesting. I'm a little troubled by the 10s. Right? But then that's a reality, right? But from your own, from our little, oh, I'm going to repeat. Where does family fall in terms of the importance in your life, with 1 being most important and 10 being of no consequence? All right. I was about to say, it is one of the realities that family could be a 10. Some people don't know their family, you know? Some people have no idea who their family is, you know? Some people have lost their family. So, the 10s will happen. You will have 10s, right? So in this segment, we will take a look at religion, education, and Caribbean family life. And what we will go through is we'll take an overview of how religion and education have shaped Caribbean family life, basically. Right? I see some people struggling, 1, 2, 5, not sure where to put them. All right. All right. So one of the things that we would see is that within Caribbean society, excuse me, within Caribbean society, Judeo-Christian values have had a significant impact. All right. And when I speak of Judeo-Christian values, I'm speaking of what we would colloquially refer to as Christianity. And I'm not saying that everybody is Christian, but I'm saying that these Christian values have had a significant impact on the social norms. And largely because many of our institutions came out of and reflected these Christian values. Or I should say many of our institutions that were powerful, all right? So many of the ideas we have about respectability and acceptability and what it means to be a good man and what it means to be a good woman and all of these different things, they often relate to these Christian values. Some of the ways that we would see Christianity impacting even where you had populations that were not Christian. We saw, even where you had populations that were not Christian, you see these Christian values at work. And a very good example would have been the mission schools that I would have referred to earlier. So you would have had separate Christian schools established for the East Indian children. But one of the things that would have impacted upon the change that we would have seen in terms of a resurgence of Hinduism and Islam, because our East Indian indentured laborers were Hindus and Muslims. You would have had the rise of Indian nationalism and this anti-colonial drive for independence, of which, of course, we know Gandhi was a leading proponent of. And as you had this rise in Indian pride and this assertion of Indian national identity, part and parcel of that would have been a resurgence of these religions that were popular in India. So you would have this resurgence of Muslim communities and Hindu communities organizing themselves and practicing, gaining a greater confidence in practicing their religion. And why I say gaining greater confidence is because these religions were persecuted, for want of a better word. They were not supported. All right. Hindus and Muslims were great targets for Christian missionaries because it was felt that these religions were not acceptable, that these people had to be Christianized. So that resurgence was important. It was an important way of asserting an identity that challenged the Eurocentric status quo. And to that end, we had the establishment of the Hindu and Muslim organizations. And these organizations not only oversaw the rise of schools that were dedicated to the religious instruction and the academic instruction of these children into Hinduism and Islam, but you also had the language and cultures of the East Indians also being propagated through these institutions, so that we see now a diversity. You have a diversity happening here. So you have this movement away, or a pulling away from these Christian values, so that you have other values also now infiltrating and shaping Caribbean family life. When it comes to some of these norms in relation to family, we have to consider what happened with emancipation, because this was significant, particularly as it relates to family. With emancipation, you had the opportunity for the reconstruction of family. West African women were not brought here as wives and mothers. They were brought here as workers. They came here to work, just as the men came here to work. Enslaved people were tools that were used for production. And in that process, you had a disruption of family. Children were sold away from their parents. Husbands were sold away from their wives, and so on. So with the end of slavery, the opportunity was created for family to get back together, to be reestablished among the West Africans in the Caribbean. In terms of value systems, while West African women were often revered in traditional cultures in West Africa, and they were revered because they had this life-giving role, all right? And then you also had, in many African religious traditions, you had goddess worship, all right? So the idea of a supreme spiritual being in the form of woman, all right? That did not exist in these cultures that were established in the Caribbean, which were so heavily influenced by European cultures. And so the extent to which these kinds of traditions were retained was the extent to which largely the women were able to pass on these cultures to their children, even through enslavement. So emancipation gave the African women in particular, because they held, despite slavery, they still held such a central role in the socialization of the children and the passing on of these traditions. With emancipation, it gave them more freedom to focus on the nurturing of the family, right? But of course, this nurturing of the family and the amount of attention that can be given to, let's say, a role of a housewife, which would have been a new role, right? Coming out of slavery. This was always subject to the economic conditions. Because if the family couldn't survive, I mean, it would disintegrate. So oftentimes, the economic needs would take precedence. So that while women certainly had more time for the nurturing of the family, oftentimes they still had to dedicate significant amount of their days to working in order to sustain the family, along with the man of the house, the husband or whoever it may be, right? For the women also, emancipation gave them the opportunity for respectability, in the sense of the idea of now living in a family, as opposed to being this constant subject of sexual abuse. All right. So emancipation created a lot of changes for the West African society in the Caribbean, and in particular for the women. And the reason why it is so significant to focus on the changes for the women is because the women continued to have such an important role in socialization of the children. All right. Now, in terms of the impact of religion and education on the Caribbean family, we can look at it in several categories. So in terms of acceptance of the status quo, you had religion functioning oftentimes to support the status quo in many instances. All right, so we would have seen that there had to be a certain amount of cooperation with the slave owners, all right, so that the missionaries couldn't rock the boat too much. They couldn't challenge the status quo, because they would simply be ejected from the plantations. They would be sent away. And oftentimes you have the Christian churches preaching a gospel that supported the status quo as well, so that they focused on scripture that discouraged rebellion, that discouraged radical thoughts, all right? And they focused on scripture that emphasized obedience. And what I'm talking about here is the period immediately following emancipation, because certainly if we go into the later part of the 19th century and into the 20th century, we would see religion functioning in very different ways, all right? What was the impact of religion and gender? Well, I think we can still see some of this today, where there was a sort of sexual division of labor in the traditional or the Orthodox churches, so that you had women oftentimes in supporting roles. So you had women running the Sunday school, or you would have women who would be the ushers, or you had women who would take the lead when it comes to fundraising and so on. But when it came to who was director, who was the priest in charge, it would be a man, okay? This, of course, was in contradiction to non-Orthodox West African and Caribbean churches. So in many of these syncretic religions, you actually had a role reversal, so that women were often in leadership positions in many of these syncretic African spiritual practices or syncretic religions. So when we look at, for instance, the Baptists or the Orisha, we see that women are often in leadership roles. Okay? So that religion functioned in different ways depending on if you were looking at the role of the traditional, the Orthodox Christian churches, or if you were looking at the syncretic African religious practices. All right. Is everybody with me so far? I know we're coming down to, the final stretch here. All right, good. Just making sure no one has left me. We're almost there. Right. In terms of marriage, we could see that religion has always had an impact on shaping value systems around marriage. And marriage was always a value held even among the enslaved. And while marriage ceremonies constantly took place, the marriage ceremonies were not always recognized. All right. So certainly, for instance, the Hindu marriage ceremonies were not recognized at one point, right? And of course, that created all sorts of problems because if a marriage isn't recognized, it means that inheritance is also not recognized, all right? But certainly, across our societies in the Caribbean, marriage was always a value. Right? We would have been looking at some of this already in terms of dress and appearance, but we looked at it in the context of education, acknowledging, of course, that education and religion went hand in glove in terms of how our societies develop. But religion in particular, and that ritual of going to church, that Sunday going to church ritual was a demonstration oftentimes of the extent to which you had embodied the respectable nature of the lady or the gentleman. All right. So the Sunday best concept, the idea of the Sunday best, was your demonstration of the extent to which you had acquired the values of respectable society as reflected in the appearance. Okay? Do you all understand the phenomena that I'm talking about of the Sunday best? I know it is not so much a tradition anymore, but we do still see it. All right, remember to take your video off. Right. Right. So certainly, Africans in particular, the formerly enslaved, who made up the majority of the population in our societies following emancipation, they were encouraged, all right, to mimic the example of the British men and women in terms of how they presented themselves, all right? And of course, the ritual of going to church on Sunday was a way of demonstrating that. While this may seem superficial, all of these things were important for how you were viewed and therefore the extent and the speed with which you could rise within society. Because the ability for social upward mobility at this time was certainly hinged upon your acceptability, all right? the Victorian value systems also impacted upon our societies in the creation of two spheres which separated men and women. And women were thought to inhabit the private sphere. So there's an error on the slide because women were expected to dominate the private sphere, and men and boys were expected to dominate the public sphere. What that simply meant is that women were expected to take charge of the home, and the woman was expected to do the domestic duties, and the men were expected to dominate the public sphere. So they were expected to work outside the home. They were expected to play outside the home. And so it was acceptable for men, for instance, to frequent brothels, to have fun with other women, as long as it was done outside the home. That behavior in respectable society was not supposed to come into the private sphere. So it was acceptable once it stayed in the public sphere because that was the man's domain. These ideas persisted within our societies, which were still largely influenced by these British value systems. And you started, following emancipation, to see that separation of the sexes. Because, of course, before emancipation, everybody was worker, right? Everybody was worker. So it is following emancipation, now you had that separation. Women supposed to be housewives, and they're supposed to take care of the children, and they're supposed to be inside. And the men, well, they're supposed to be outside. You know, men, you're not supposed to be inside. It is reflected in that quotation, tie the heifer, loose the bull. How many of you have ever heard that? It's an old Caribbean saying, tie the heifer, loose the bull. What does it mean? What's a heifer? What's a heifer? Thank you, Brandon. A heifer is a female cow. And what's a bull? Right? So then what does it mean? Tie the heifer, loose the bull. Or so you are on track, except that we're not talking about the cows anymore, right? Yes. You are supposed to restrain the women. You're supposed to restrain the women, and you restrain the women and girls largely because you want to keep a certain control over their sexuality. And for men, it's important to keep a control over the woman's sexuality to ensure that his inheritance is safe. Right? But these gender norms, and we will get into those a little bit later on when we deal with gender as a specific topic. But these gender norms developed in our society, largely influenced, not entirely, but largely influenced by these Victorian values. The idea of the public sphere versus the private sphere. So yes, you keep your boy children, no, you let your boy children roam, but you have to keep the girls close by. Now, despite all of the different activities surrounding feminism and the drive for equity among the sexes, do you think we still have that value system within our societies? Interesting. Okay, now I'm not asking you to judge it. I'm just asking you to look and assess and tell me if you think in our societies, we still have that value system shaping how we interact and how we socialize men and women. All right, so I'm seeing that people are largely saying yes. And it is something that we will examine in a couple of weeks. So certainly keep it in mind, because we will be looking at gender in Caribbean society, and it is something we will deal with very directly. So as we wrap up this afternoon, or this evening, sorry, what we would have looked at today was we would have looked at the different religious groups that would have come into our Caribbean society. And we would have looked at how they would have shaped, in particular, our education systems, and the interplay between or among these three important institutions in creating Caribbean identity. And these three important institutions would have been church, school, and family. So we would have looked at how religion and education would have shaped Caribbean family life based on the understanding that our religion has played a pivotal role in the development of our education systems. So on that note, I will open the floor for additional questions that you may have. Crystal, oh, you asked me a question. I am so sorry. Let me scroll up and find your question. I cannot offer you any information on Kali worship. I'm not even going to try. But it's an interesting one. You've prompted me to find out for myself. All right, Crystal, unfortunately, I can't quite see a question yet, but I'm scrolling, looking for it. All right, Crystal, can you put it back for me? It went way up in the chat. Okay, so that was the question, Crystal, about Kali worship. I don't know. I really can't offer any information about Kali worship. So I wouldn't be able to comment on the comparison. Right. But thanks for bringing it back to my attention. All right, are there any other questions? This course does not have a final exam. You can discuss your book report in your tutorial. That is the best place for that discussion to take place. What I will say to you is please be mindful of the deadline and don't wait until the last minute. If I were to offer you any suggestions on the book report, it would be to say that the quality of your analysis is going to be very dependent on the quality of your information. So certainly you need to read beyond just the book so that your analysis can be substantial and it can be based on substance. Well, Nadira, that question you're asking is one that you need to investigate as you read, and then you come to your conclusion. You come to your own assertions about that question. Oh, okay, Crystal. All right, Crystal, I'm going to find your question. I'm going to find your question because somebody's reminded you asked it more than once. So I'm going to scroll and try and find Crystal's question. All right, bear with me 1 minute. And of course, if you want to ask a question using the mic, you can certainly go right ahead. Oh gosh, I cannot seem to find Crystal's question. So if anyone can put it back for me, I would greatly appreciate that. Oh, the Kali worship, I answered that already. I don't know anything about Kali worship. I answered that one already. Oh, your mic is muted. Okay. All right, let me unmute your mic. Crystal, you can go ahead. All right, unfortunately, I cannot hear Crystal. Yeah, you can just hit unmute, right? Just click on your mic and let the red slash disappear and you can ask your question.
Hello?
Yes, we're hearing you. Go ahead.
Hi, good night, Miss. The question was, well, I know you said you don't know anything about Kali worship, but the question was in relation to how the Baptists in particular, like Ishango and Eurasia, their practices, how that had to be practiced in secrecy. From what I know about Kali worship, that's how the tradition was passed on because it was unlawful to practice it. It was deemed evil and considered taboo along the same lines as voodoo. So it was something that they would have had to practice in secrecy in like their backyards then.
Yes, yes, yes. That much I could certainly see as being true. Yes. So in terms of that similarity, yes. I thought you were talking in terms of the actual practices,
The
rituals.
spiritual context.
Yes.
Actually, it does have some similarity in it, and as you showed how basically how Christianity and Baptist kind of merged together. And hello?
Yes, I'm hearing you. Go ahead.
Right. In terms of Kali worship, in certain temples, they are actually, even though I know in Christianity they don't pray to idols, but in certain temples they actually make offerings to God in the form of Jesus as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. You do have Yes, one of the things you find in the Caribbean is a lot of that kind of syncretism taking place. All right. So even in terms of some of the traditional African spirituality, you see some of the same rituals, you see some of the same paraphernalia, some of the same icons or iconography as Hinduism, for instance. Okay. It's a very rich and interesting area of study. And it's definitely something that I should pay a little more attention to understanding, because yes, you do have that kind of syncretism taking place there. All right, so thank you for sharing that. Certainly. All right, so are there any more questions? All right, so with that in mind, I will ask you to all ensure that you get to your tutorials this week, initiate discussions with your tutors, and ensure that you submit your book report in good time. All right. So we are going to end as we began with music from the Caribbean. And this one I did especially for all of you who may be feeling a little pressured at this point in time. I know this is the time of labs and final exam preparation. Some of you actually still have midterms and all of these different things. So I am giving you a somewhat whimsical song that I hope will take your stress away.